Welcome to the deep dive. There's this old question, does history repeat itself or does it just, well, rhyme? What if you could actually see the patterns, the ones that seem to govern how empires rise and inevitably fall, and maybe use that to understand our own times a bit better? Today we're diving into Ray Dalio's Principles for Dealing with a Changing World Order. Now, Dalio, he's an investor, not strictly a historian, but his whole deep look at history, it actually started from, well, a pretty expensive mistake he made early on.
That's right. It really stemmed from personal experience. He was young, just 22, clerking on the New York Stock Exchange floor back in '71. He mentions it was a different time. Traders apparently had water pistol fights on the floor, believe it or not.
Wow, really? Water pistols?
Yeah. But amidst that, he got completely blindsided by some huge market moves. Things, as he put it, that hadn't happened in my lifetime, but had happened many times before. And that shock, that feeling of, wait, history has lessons I missed? That's what pushed him. He became obsessed with studying these timeless cause and effect relationships across centuries. He wanted to know why things kept happening.
And that's really our goal here today. We're using Dalio's massive research effort as, let's say, a shortcut. We want to pull out the key insights from his framework to help you make sense of the big shifts happening in the world order right now and maybe get a feel for what could be next. We'll focus on his main idea, these big cycles, and then unpack three major themes from his work.
Okay, so let's start with that core concept, the big cycle. Dalio sees it almost like history's perpetual motion machine. What's really interesting is how he describes it. He says history typically transpires via relatively well-defined life cycles, like those of organisms that evolve as each generation transitions to the next.
Like organisms. So birth, growth, decline, that kind of thing.
Exactly. He found it was fundamentally the same things happening over and over again for basically the same reasons, even while things obviously evolve over time.
So it's not identical repetition, but the patterns. The underlying dynamics are similar. And these cycles, they create huge swings, right?
Huge swings. You get these peaceful and prosperous periods, lots of creativity, productivity, living standards go way up. But then you also get the flip side, depression, revolution, and war periods. Lots of fighting over wealth and power, destruction, the darker side of history.
It's quite a contrast. But he does offer some comfort there, doesn't he? Something about the length of those periods.
He does. He notes the peaceful, productive times are usually much longer than the chaotic transitions, roughly about 5.1, he estimates. So more good times than bad overall.
Okay, that's somewhat reassuring.
It is. And Dalio makes a great point about how our own immediate experience can kind of blind us to these bigger sweeps of history. He uses his own father as an example, lived through the Great Depression, World War II. For him, the idea of the huge post-war boom was almost unimaginable based on what he'd seen.
Right. His reality was shaped by scarcity and conflict.
Exactly. And Dalio argues the reverse is also true. If you've only ever known, say, debt-fueled booms, it's hard to really wrap your head around the possibility of severe depression or war. So to see these mega macro cycles, you kind of have to consciously step back from the day-to-day noise, let go of the minute details, and look for that bigger pattern.
It's a shift in perspective, really. And Dalio doesn't just talk about cycles in general. He identifies specific ones that he thinks are critical, doesn't he?
Yes, he focuses on three big cycles that he believes are most important to watch.
Okay, what are they?
First, the long-term debt and capital market cycle, money, credit, finance. Second, the internal order and disorder cycle. That's about stability, conflict, wealth distribution within a country. And third, the external order and disorder cycle, how nations interact, alliances, conflicts between countries.
Debt, internal stability, external relations. Makes sense.
And his core principle ties them all together. He says, basically, history and logic show that when a country simultaneously has all three in their good phases, it is strong and rising.
And when all three are in their bad phases, it is weak and declining. Pretty clear logic there.
Very clear. And that leads us nicely into the second major idea, that internal order and disorder cycle. This is really about the struggles inside a nation. Dalio argues that fundamentally, the biggest thing affecting most people in most countries through time is the struggle to make, take, and distribute wealth and power.
The age-old question of who gets what, basically?
Pretty much. He highlights this symbiotic relationship. You've got those with wealth who own the means of production, and those with political power who make and enforce the rules. They often work together, reinforcing each other.
And Dalio sees a problem with that balance right now.
A big one. He wrote that Wealth, values, and political gaps are now larger than at any other point during my lifetime.
Yeah.
And his research, he says, shows these dramatic differences in conditions between the haves and the have-nots.
Which leads to?
Well, he connects it directly to greater polarity and populism. It's not just economic. It spills over into values, politics, creating deep divisions.
And he actually places the U.S. at a specific point in this cycle, right?
He does. At the time he was writing, he put the U.S. in what he calls Stage 5. That's a stage defined by bad financial conditions and intense conflict.
Intense conflict.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound good.
No. And he says this stage typically follows periods of, well, excess, too much spending, too much debt, widening wealth gaps, and often comes before major upheavals like revolutions or even civil wars.
Wow. He identifies specific conditions for this, doesn't he? A toxic mix.
Yeah, the classic toxic mix, he calls it. 3 key ingredients. 1, the country and its people are in bad financial shape, think big debts. 2, large gaps in income, wealth, and even values. And 3, some kind of severe negative economic shock hits.
That does sound like a recipe for trouble. And this ties into populism.
Directly. He defines populism pretty broadly as this phenomenon appealing to ordinary people who feel ignored by the elites.
And it's not just one side of the political aisle.
No, he's very clear on that. Populists can be of the left or of the right, he says. They tend to be more extreme than moderates and appeal more to emotion. He gives examples from recent U.S. politics, Trump representing populism of the right, and figures like Sanders, Warren, AOC reflecting populism of the left. He's reporting on the phenomenon across the board.
Okay. And one really concerning aspect of this internal division he points out is about truth itself, isn't it?
Yes, profoundly concerning. He calls it the loss of truth in the public domain. This is where media gets polarized, used as a weapon almost. He cites this startling Gallup poll from 2019. Only 13% of Americans had a great deal of trust in the media. 13%.
13. Wow. Compared to what it used to be.
Compared to 72% back in 1976. A massive drop.
Good grief.
And it leads to that fundamental question. Martin Barron, who is editor of the Washington Post, asked, if you have a society where people can't agree on the basic facts, how do you have a functioning democracy?
That's the core issue, isn't it? How do you function?
Dalio concludes the U.S. internal conflict level is comparable to the late 60s. You know, civil rights, Vietnam protests, and political conflict is the highest it's been since the early 1920s.
So deep internal struggles. But these don't happen in isolation, right? They must affect how a country deals with the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Which brings us to Dalio's third major idea, the external order and disorder cycle, how nations interact on the global stage.
And how does he describe that world?
He's pretty blunt, actually. He says in international relations, basically, power prevails, and that wealth and power aren't usually given up without a fight. He stresses that the international order follows the law of the jungle much more than international law. It's about who has the strength.
The law of the jungle. So might makes right, essentially.
That seems to be his assessment of how things actually work, yes. And this leads to different kinds of conflict.
Right, he talks about 5 types of wars,
Yeah.
but not all of them involve shooting, do they?
Exactly. It's a broader definition. He lists trade economic wars, technology wars, capital wars, geopolitical wars, and military wars. And importantly, he notes the first 4 trade, tech, capital, geopolitics often build up as intense competitions before any actual military conflict breaks out. It's usually a progression.
Okay, so where does he see these playing out most clearly today?
The prime example he uses is the relationship between the U.S. and China. He argues they are currently fighting 4 out of these 5 wars.
4 out of 5. Which ones?
Everything except direct military war. So trade economic, technology, capital, and geopolitical. And he adds they're not intensely, but they are intensifying. The heat is turning up.
Okay, let's quickly touch on those. The trade war.
He sees the tariffs, the import restrictions as classic signs, even reminiscent of things like the Smoot-Hawley tariff back in 1930, which many think worsened the Great Depression.
A historical echo. And he notes both U.S. parties are pretty aligned on this, right? Being tough on China trade-wise.
Yes, a rare point of bipartisan agreement, being hawkish on China.
Then the technology war.
This is about China's rapid advances, 5G, AI, supercomputing, churning out STEM graduates. He says China's technological innovation abilities are improving at a faster pace, while the U.S. lead is shrinking.
Huawei is an example he uses.
Yeah, as an example of technology seen as threatening by the U.S., it's about dominance in future tech.
Okay, third, the capital war. This sounds a bit more complex.
It is. He highlights this awkward, big debtor-creditor relationship. It struck him as odd that China, where average incomes were way lower, was essentially lending vast sums to Americans to buy goods, often made in China.
So the U.S. borrowing from China to buy Chinese products.
Kind of, yeah. It shows how emerging economies saving in the dominant currency, like the US dollar, can actually lead to the dominant country becoming over-indebted. A strange feedback loop.
And finally, the geopolitical war.
This is about influence and alliances. He sees countries increasingly having to weigh their alignment. Do they lean towards the US or China? Often, he notes, countries might choose China for economic benefits, but still look to the US for security, though maybe questioning that commitment now. And China's influence in international bodies is growing as the US sometimes steps back.
So 4 active wars simmering. What about the 5th one, military? Does he think that's likely?
He suggests the threat of mutual destruction, like during the Cold War with the USSR, should prevent a hot war. Maybe, you know? But he identifies one potential flashpoint, a major red line.
Taiwan.
Exactly. He calls Taiwan the only possible trigger for a military war between the two greatest powers in the next 10 years. Why? Because China sees it as fundamentally different, a one-of-a-kind interest that China would fight for.
The uniquely dangerous point of friction.
Extremely dangerous.
Wow. Okay, so stepping back from all this.
Yeah.
These big cycles, the internal conflicts, the external rivalries, it's a lot to take in.
Mm-hmm.
But the value here isn't about having a crystal ball, is it? It's more about preparation, understanding the possibilities.
That's exactly it. Understanding these historical patterns helps you anticipate, helps you prepare, so you're not completely blindsided by things that, frankly, have happened many times before in different forms. It's about knowing the range of what could happen based on what has happened.
And Dalio ties this back to a very personal principle for himself, right?
Yeah.
How he deals with uncertainty.
He does. His philosophy is basically know all the possibilities, think about the worst-case scenarios, and then find ways to eliminate the intolerable ones. It's about managing risk by understanding history.
Which actually leads to a challenge for you, listening right now. Dalio suggests applying this thinking to your own life. He says, pencil out what your financial safety margin looks like. Ask yourself, how long would you be financially okay if a worst-case scenario hit, like losing your job and your investments dropped significantly?
Maybe losing half their value, he suggests, just to account for price falls, taxes, inflation. It's a tough exercise, maybe a bit scary.
Definitely sobering, but probably a really useful one, given the historical cycles we've just talked about.
Absolutely. And maybe we can leave you with one last big question that Dalio raises, particularly focused on the U.S., but perhaps relevant elsewhere too. He asks, the greatest challenges it faces are internal ones. Can it remain strong and united? Or will it continue to allow division and internal struggles to lead to decline?
A crucial question for our time. Something to keep observing, perhaps, through this lens of historical cycles.